I never thought I'd end up as a farmer. Growing up, I spent every summer at Grandpa's farm, barefoot in the fields, learning how to care for peach trees and listening to his stories about the land. But as I got older, life pulled me in a different direction. I ended up in a cramped apartment in the city, working a job that paid well but drained my soul. Then everything changed. It had only been 2 months since Grandpa's funeral when the letter arrived. The envelope was thick and official-looking, the kind that made your stomach drop before you even opened it. Certified notice, mineral rights claim. I read the first few lines, then read them again. The Sycamore Heights Homeowners Association claims ownership of all mineral rights beneath your property and will begin excavation in 4 weeks. I nearly dropped my coffee. This had to be a mistake. My grandfather would have never signed something like this. This farm had been in our family for generations. He loved this land, every tree, every fence post, every blade of grass. If he had known anyone was trying to take it from us, he would have fought tooth and nail. I grabbed my phone and dialed the number on the letter. After being transferred 3 times, a clipped, cold voice answered. Margaret Holloway speaking. Ms. Holloway, this is Tom Mitchell. I just received a letter saying your HOA owns the mineral rights to my farm. That can't be right. A pause. Then, in a voice like polished steel, she said, There's no mistake, Mr. Mitchell. Your grandfather signed an agreement 2 years ago. It's legally binding. My jaw tightened. That's impossible. My grandfather would never. Perhaps you didn't know him as well as you thought, she interrupted. Excavation begins next month. Have a nice day. Click. I stood there, gripping the phone, my heart pounding. This wasn't just about paperwork. This was war. That afternoon, I took a drive to the edge of my farm, where my land met Sycamore Heights. I had always hated the sight of that place. The identical houses, perfect lawns, and strict rules. It was everything Grandpa's farm wasn't. A woman was outside, kneeling in her garden near the fence. As I walked up, she stood and wiped her hands on her jeans. You must be Tom's grandson, she said with a sad smile. I'm Elaine. Your grandfather was a good man. Did you know him well? I asked, watching her closely. She hesitated, then lowered her voice, as well as anyone could. He used to bring me peaches every summer. But listen, you need be careful. That HOA, especially Margaret Holloway, they've wanted your land for years. A chill ran up my spine. What do you mean? Elaine glanced over her shoulder, then leaned in. They offered your grandfather a lot of money. He refused, said the land wasn't for sale. After that, Margaret got persistent. A car door slammed in the distance. Elaine straightened and put her gloves back on. I should get back to my flowers. HOA only allows approved plants. Got fined last month for planting the wrong ones. She forced a laugh, but her eyes were wary. As I walked away, a silver SUV crawled past. Behind the wheel was a woman with perfectly styled gray hair. She stared at me, her gaze sharp and assessing. Margaret Holloway. She wasn't just watching me. She was waiting. That night, I tore through Grandpa's old filing cabinet. There had to be something. Some record. Some proof that this was a lie. I went through decades of paperwork. Receipts, tax documents, even weather logs. But nothing about mineral rights. Until I found the folder. It was labeled property documents in Grandpa's careful handwriting. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages. And then there was the original deed from 1963. I held my breath as I read the fine print. All mineral rights conveyed with the property. No provisions for separation. I exhaled sharply. That meant no one but the property owner could claim those rights. No HOA. No Margaret Holloway. I barely slept that night. At sunrise, I drove straight to the county records office. Frank, the records clerk, peered at me over his glasses as I explained the situation. Let's take a look, he said, typing into his computer. A few minutes later, he frowned and turned the screen toward me. Well, that's interesting. There was a mineral rights transfer filed 2 years ago, signed by Thomas Mitchell. I felt the blood drain from my face. Can I see it? Frank printed out a copy. At the bottom was Grandpa's signature. But something was off. I stared at it. The loops in the letters weren't right. The way he wrote his T's was different. Something felt wrong. Frank, do you have any other documents my grandfather signed? He rummaged through some files and pulled out a property tax appeal from 5 years ago. I placed them side by side, and then I saw it. The signature on the mineral rights document was forged, and the date, April 15th, 2022. My grip tightened on the paper. That was the month Grandpa was in the hospital after his stroke. He couldn't even hold a pen, let alone sign a legal document. This wasn't just fraud. This was theft. I called Aunt Susan, Grandpa's youngest sister. Did Grandpa ever mention selling the mineral rights? I asked. Her answer was immediate. Never. I swallowed hard. Does the date April 15th, 2022 mean anything to you? A pause. Then her voice turned sharp. That was right after his stroke. Tom, he could barely move his hands. There's no way he signed anything. I clenched my jaw. It's a forgery. Susan's voice softened. What are you going to do? I stared out at the fields Grandpa had spent his life caring for. Whatever it takes. That night, I heard a buzzing sound outside. I stepped onto the porch and looked up. A drone hovered over my eastern field, the very area the HOA claimed had valuable minerals. I took a step forward, and the drone zipped back toward Sycamore Heights. They were watching me. They were planning something. But now, I knew something they didn't. Their entire claim was built on a lie. The next morning, I knocked on Elaine's door. I need your help. She let me in, and I spread my evidence across the kitchen table. The forged document, the real deed, the drone footage. Her face darkened. Margaret has gone too far. She grabbed her phone. There are others, people who are tired of her games. Meet us tonight. That evening, in the back room of a coffee shop, I found myself sitting with 7 strangers. Sarah, a young mother, leaned forward. Margaret has been bullying us for years. But this is criminal. James, a retired attorney, study my papers. If we expose this, we can stop her, but we need proof. I nodded. Then let's get it. As we left, Sarah suddenly grabbed my arm. Wait. She pointed across the street. A car was parked there. Inside, Margaret Holloway sat, pretending to check her phone. She had followed me. She knew we were organizing, and that meant one thing. She was getting desperate. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my grandfather standing in the peach orchard, shaking his head at me. You've got a fight on your hands, kid, he'd say. But you already know that. I did, and I wasn't backing down. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, I replayed every detail of the HOA's claim. They said it was about mineral rights, that my land held valuable limestone deposits. But something about that didn't sit right. Why forge a signature for limestone? Why sneak around with drones and forge papers for something that wasn't even rare? I needed to know the truth. So, the next morning, I called an old friend, Professor Wilson, an environmental geologist I'd gone to college with. Limestone deposits? She repeated when I explained the situation. Tom, I've been to your area before. It's just regular farmland. Nothing valuable under there. Could you check? I asked. I need to be absolutely sure. She agreed to run some soil tests that evening. That afternoon, I walked out toward my eastern field, where the HOA had claimed their precious deposits were located. And that's when I saw them. 2 men, both in hard hats, hammering survey stakes into the ground like they owned the place. My blood ran hot. I stormed toward them. What do you think you're doing? One of them barely glanced at me. Surveying. HOA hired us. We have permits. I crossed my arms. Let me see them. The shorter guy hesitated. Take it up with the HOA, buddy. I pulled out my phone. Then you won't mind if I call Sheriff Martinez to verify that paperwork. They exchanged a glance. Then, without a word, they yanked the stakes from the ground and left. They were testing me. I had just shown them I wasn't going to be easy to push around. Professor Wilson arrived at sundown, her old Subaru rattling up my driveway. We worked in silence, collecting soil samples from different parts of the land, using nothing but the moonlight to guide us. Every rustling leaf made me paranoid. I wouldn't put it past Margaret Holloway to have someone watching us. By morning, she had the results. She frowned at the data. There's nothing special about your soil, Tom. No rare minerals, no high-value limestone deposits, nothing that justifies an excavation. I exhaled. So they're lying. Not just lying, she corrected. Completely fabricating this. I clenched my jaw. That meant they weren't after minerals at all. They wanted something else. That night, I met up with James and the others again. He had spent the past few days digging through public records. He slid a file toward me. I think I found the real reason they want your land. I opened the folder. It was a county development plan, a highway expansion project. A new highway exit was scheduled to be built, and the only viable access point, my eastern field. I sat back, gripping the paper. This was never about minerals. James shook his head. Nope, it's about money. If that highway came through, Sycamore Heights property values would skyrocket. Margaret, who owned 3 houses in the neighborhood, would make a fortune. Her husband, one of the biggest real estate developers in the county, would make even more. I let out a slow breath. She tried to steal my land for profit. James nodded. And now we expose her. Margaret Holloway thrived in the shadows. She had built a network of power through intimidation and secrecy. So the best way to take her down? Drag her into the light. We need to take this public, I told my group. Sarah, who ran a local blog, nodded. I can write an article. Get the word out before she realizes what we're doing. Michael, a local activist, grinned. I have a cousin at Channel 6 News. They'd love the story. James leaned forward. We also need a handwriting expert to confirm the forgery. Once we have that, we go straight to the sheriff. By 9 p.m., Sarah's article went live. HOA caught in land grab scheme. Farmer fights back. By midnight, it had over 1,500 shares. By morning, Channel 6 News was calling me for an interview. And just like I expected, Margaret Holloway retaliated. At exactly 8 a.m., I stepped outside and stopped in my tracks. A bright orange notice was plastered across my front gate. Property access restricted pending mineral excavation. Standing beside it were 2 massive security guards, arms crossed. I stormed toward them. Move. One of them handed me a piece of paper. Sorry, sir. The HOA filed legal access rights for surveying. I snatched the document. My jaw tightened. Margaret had called an emergency HOA meeting and fast-tracked a motion to grant themselves temporary control over my land. It wasn't legally binding, but it would take weeks to fight in court. They were trying to starve me out, but I wasn't that guy anymore. I pulled out my phone and dialed the sheriff. Sheriff Martinez. I said, keeping my voice calm. I need you at my farm. Now. By the time the sheriff arrived, a news van had already pulled up. Margaret Holloway arrived minutes later. She stepped out of her SUV in an immaculate suit, flanked by her lawyers, her chin held high. The cameras rolled as she flashed a fake smile. This is a simple misunderstanding, she purred. We have legal rights to the excavation. I turned to reporters. There are no minerals here. Their claim is based on a forgery. Gasps rippled through the crowd. I pulled out my grandfather's original deed and held it up. This proves all mineral rights belong to me. But 2 years ago, the HOA claimed he signed them away. While he was in the hospital, unable to hold pen, the sheriff stepped forward. And we have a handwriting expert confirming the signature was forged. Margaret's smile faltered. This is absurd. James stepped forward, holding another document. And here's something else. The county's secret plan for a highway exit. This isn't about minerals. This is about money. The crowd erupted in whispers. A reporter shoved a microphone in Margaret's face. Ms. Holloway, do you have a response? She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. The sheriff sighed and pulled out his cuffs. Margaret Holloway, You're under arrest for fraud, forgery, and illegal land acquisition." As she was led away, I turned and looked at my farm. They had come at me with lies, intimidation, and money, but in the end, all it took to bring them down was the truth, and I had won. The night after Margaret's arrest, I felt something I hadn't in weeks: relief. It didn't last long. At 11:47 p.m., my phone buzzed. "Sarah." I picked up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. "Everything okay?" Her voice was sharp. "No. Someone broke into the HOA office tonight. All the financial records are gone." I sat up straight. "Gone? Like stolen?" "Completely wiped out. And Tom, there's something else." She hesitated. "I just drove past your orchard. There's a bulldozer parked at the edge of your property." I threw the blankets off and grabbed my boots. "I'm on my way." By the time I reached the orchard, headlights were appearing on the road. First one vehicle, then another, then three more. For a split second, I thought it was them, Margaret's people, coming to finish the job. Then I saw James step out his car. Behind him, about 15 neighbors followed, carrying flashlights and shovels. I let out a breath. "Back up. Heard about the bulldozer." James said, walking up, "Figured you might need some company." Sarah nodded toward the machine. "Margaret's nephew and his buddy are over there. They work for her husband's construction company." I turned toward the two men standing near the bulldozer, smoking like they had all the time in the world. I squared my shoulders and walked straight for them. "You're trespassing." They turned, startled by the sheer number of people behind me. The taller one sneered. "We're just following orders." James held up a legal document. "Court records say different. This land still legally belongs to Tom, and destroying property during a legal dispute, that's a felony." The men glanced at each other. Then, more headlights appeared in the distance. Sheriff Martinez. The construction workers scrambled into their truck and sped off, leaving the bulldozer behind. Martinez sighed, shaking his head. They were planning something tonight. Then he turned to me. "I'll have deputies stationed here 24/7 until this case is over." For the first time in weeks, I exhaled. The HOA had lost its element of surprise. Now, all that was left was to finish this fight. 3 weeks later, I stepped into a packed courthouse. Margaret and her husband arrived in matching designer outfits, flanked by their lawyers. They looked confident, smug, like they still had an ace up their sleeve. I clenched my fists. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes, glanced through our evidence. "Mrs. Holloway, these are serious allegations. What do you have to say?" Margaret smiled tightly. "Your Honor, this is all a misunderstanding. The HOA was simply acting in the community's best interest." James stood. "Let's talk about that misunderstanding. We have proof that the mineral rights claim was based on a forged document. My client's grandfather was hospitalized at the time and physically unable to sign anything. He handed over medical records and a handwriting analysis confirming the forgery. Margaret's lawyer cleared his throat. Even if there were irregularities, the Sycamore Heights community would benefit tremendously from this project." Sarah stood up. "As the newly elected HOA president, I can state that our community opposes this project. We've also filed separate charges for the missing HOA funds." The judge frowned. "Missing funds?" James handed over bank statements. $200,000 transferred from HOA accounts into a private business owned by Margaret's husband. Margaret turned pale. The judge removed her glasses. "Mrs. Holloway, you and 2 former board members will face criminal charges for fraud, forgery, and misappropriation of funds." Margaret suddenly stood, jabbing a finger at me. "You stupid farmer. Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? My husband runs this county." The judge slammed her gavel. "Not anymore, he doesn't." Margaret was escorted out in handcuffs. And just like that, the battle was over. Margaret and her husband sold their house and fled town while awaiting trial. The county, embarrassed by the scandal, revised its rural preservation policies to protect landowners like me. And the highway? The commission scrapped the old plan and built a new route that didn't threaten family farms. As for my land, I decided to turn it into something bigger. With the help of my neighbors, I built a farmer's market and community center on the edge of my property. Every weekend, locals gathered to buy fresh produce, attend workshops, and share meals. Kids from Sycamore Heights came after school to help with the animals. The same land Margaret had tried to steal, it became the heart of the community. One afternoon, I sat on the porch, watching children play in a field where bulldozers had nearly destroyed everything. Mr. Jenkins, my elderly neighbor, rocked beside me, sipping lemonade. He chuckled. Your grandfather fought developers 3 times over the years. You know what he always said. I smiled. What's that? This land has a purpose beyond money. I nodded. Now, I finally understood. Margaret had claimed she owned the mineral rights, but she had missed what was truly valuable. Not what was beneath the soil, but what was growing on it. Community, connection, legacy. The highway eventually came, but with an exit plan that preserved my farm and actually improved access to our community market. And here's the funniest part. Property values in Sycamore Heights rose even higher than Margaret's plan would have achieved. In trying to steal my land, the HOA had accidentally helped create something more valuable than they ever imagined, because they thought mineral rights were priceless. But what really mattered was community, and that is something no one can steal. The end. Party popper.